everyone, and welcome to the International Church podcast. Today, our topic for discussion, again with Paul Helm and KJ Pugh, is overcoming anxiety during a pandemic, a global pandemic that we're all in. Guys, are you stressed?
I'll start with that, Paul. No. Yesterday I wrote, not at the moment, no. Maybe today I feel a little more anxiety, and maybe that defines it pretty well. There's kind of ups and downs, but in general, I would say generally no. I did have some initial fears and still think about them every so often, thinking about, the fact that we have supporters, financially that allow us to be here in France, and thinking that with the economic consequences that, some people, and that will create hardship for us. There's been kind of family fear that if the lockdown continues indefinitely, which it seems like they always keep extending it, right? We are thankful for May 11th as a clear date, but and the fact that the kids will likely be restarting school. But it makes you a little bit fearful of, can we handle this as a family in an apartment? It's just not easy to be living internationally with the further it goes, I should say. So this overextended lockdown. Abby and I had a conversation where we thought, could we handle it if it just kept going and going, and not having the open spaces and the comfort of family? So my anxiety in these times comes from the possibilities that my mind can dwell on. Right. And so I feel at peace when I'm not overthinking too much. But I don't, for me at least personally, I think different people experience this differently. I don't think about specific things, like overly specific. The thoughts in my head are more feelings, kind of dark thoughts, or just brooding on maybe a feeling of hopelessness. That when it's really bad, there can just be this blah that's in my heart and head. And, I think that comes from reflecting on the future, thinking that, whatever possibilities, dark, evil possibilities are possible, are definitely going to happen. And, even the evil in the world is possible, right? We see it all through history, but these aren't the final words. So as a Christian, I find rest in, and I can calm my mind knowing that the Lord is sovereign. He is present and near today, regardless of whatever comes in the future. My kids have been memorizing this verse from Isaiah 26. You keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you because he trusts in you. And that was encouraging for me just to hear them saying it out loud in the living room this past week. So.
Yeah. KJ?
Yeah, I would say on the whole, no, I'm not stressed, but stress is often a moment by moment thing versus a complete presence or absence of stress. It's like a little bit of pepper that's in your sugar. All the sugar can be there, and you add in, just sprinkle in a few moments of something that's hard, something that's bitter, amidst the things that are generally peaceful and good. I've had a few of those moments mixed in, and my moments of stress have mostly been, I would call, just imagination spiraling, of thinking worst case scenario, both for something going on with our family, our individual situation, and for the world in general. One example of that would be Lynn, my wife, had a fever out of the blue a week ago, and right away your mind goes to worst case scenario. What if we have to call an ambulance? First of all, how do you call an ambulance in France? And then she has to go away to the hospital, and we're left here, and we don't know.
And she's there, and you can't visit her, and she can't French, and yeah.
So you imagination spiraling. I start picturing all these situations, but that again is like the pepper just sprinkled in a little bit in the sugar.
Right.
And most of those worries will never see the light of day, never see reality. My biggest worry within reason is that we live here in France with a wonderful lady in her 90s, and we just want to take every precaution we can not to contract a virus that we would in turn spread to her.
Yeah.
So stress then is mainly these added layers of thought that's needed for everyday life now. I don't know if you feel like this, but going outside, it feels like I'm stepping into a post-apocalyptic world with my head covered, my face covered. I'm wiping down everything. When I come back in, it's like I'm coming through a decontamination series of things, of throwing everything in the wash right away, taking a shower, wiping everything down. And so stress is kind of peppered into our lives, but it doesn't define life right now. And as Christians, I think we encounter stress when it comes, but when it comes, we encounter it differently than other people as well.
Yeah. Well, and we'll get on that theme in a little bit later of, this tension of appropriate concern without it turning into anxiety. And that's a difficult tension for us. I think for me, when I examine my anxieties and my fears, I often find my idols. You tend to worry about losing the things that you feel like you think you can't lose, the things that you value. And oftentimes those things that I fear losing are things that I'm putting over the Lord. And so in Jesus and in the gospel and my relationship with God, I have something that can't be lost, a gift that God has given me. And finding security in that is important during these times. But again, I go to that tension of there are things I should care about and even care about losing. And so there's that tension I find between what is an appropriate amount of concern without it turning into what Jesus says not to have, which is anxiety. So let's go on to this second question I want us to talk just in terms of because worry is a part of everyone's life. Jesus didn't ignore the fact that people are anxious. He said not to be anxious about tomorrow, but he there's an understanding that this is an issue for Christians and for non-Christians. So the question is, how does the gospel change the way we approach our worries?
Yeah, I think if it wasn't clear before, let me say first what it doesn't change. It doesn't change the fact that moments of worry and stress will still come for Christians. God doesn't offer us a complete exemption from anxiety, stressful situations, like getting a vaccine, right, that would eliminate the possibility of us being worried, catching anxiety. God doesn't give us a vaccine, but God does offer us an always available remedy, like medicine that fights a reoccurring problem, a reoccurring struggle for us. So I think first we need to recognize that God has clearly made known his will in this area. Mm-hmm. He says to us, do not be worried about your life. Matthew 7:25. Do not be worried about tomorrow. Verse 34. Do not fear. Matthew chapter 10. Do not be anxious. Be anxious for nothing. Philippians 4:6. God commands us in this area. He commands our emotions in this area. And we know deep down that his commands are for our good and for our flourishing. But we shouldn't leave it just at that, because God doesn't leave it just at that. God not only tells us not to worry, but he also gives us the truth we need to fight off our fears. Don't be worried about your life. Why? Because God cares for the birds of the sky, for the flowers of the field. If he cares for them, he cares far more for you. Don't worry about tomorrow, because God already knows what you need tomorrow. He's there ahead of you. Do not fear, because the very hairs on your head are all numbered, and not one's going to fall out apart from God's will. Be anxious for nothing, because you have a Father who is working all things together for your good and for his glory. I think Christians still encounter fear, worry, anxiety. If we were vaccinated against the worry and anxiety, then the Bible wouldn't talk so much about it, would it? The Bible's talking about it all over the place. It's because we still encounter it. As Christians, we don't have a vaccine, but we do have the right medicine. It's a medicine the world doesn't have. We have the right medicine. We are called to fight fear with truth.
Mm-hmm.
And truth that goes beyond just factual probabilities, like that I'm likely not to get the virus, or if I do get it, I'm likely not to die from it. We're called to fight not by telling ourselves the odds, but with gospel truth.
Mm-hmm.
God will work for good, even if the worst should happen to me. It doesn't mean those fears won't come back and attack you 100 times a day, but God gives you the weapons to fight them off and gives you 100 opportunities to trust him and show that he is bigger than your fears. And when as Christians, we lose that fight, we know what to do. We repent, and in humility, we rise to fight again.
KJ made me think of alluding again to Jesus in the Gospels. I was reading the story with my kids the other night from the Jesus Storybook Bible, which is a great little resource for kids, especially younger ones. But there's one called The Singer, and it's about when Jesus says, look at the flowers of the field. Are they not clothed, much more splendorously than Solomon was in all of his heyday? And I was like, okay, kids. And honestly, when I was reading this the other night, it struck me. And it's so simple, right? But it just struck me that Jesus would use this, and that speaks so directly to our hearts. I was just like, are flowers made in the image of God?
Mm.
No. Are flowers beautiful and, just a delight to look at? And especially right in spring, we're thinking of this. Abby just brought some flowers home. Yes. Okay, well then, if God made us in his image, how much more, are we going to be beautiful and magnificent as he does his work, and he redeems us, and one day in the new creation he fully reveals what we were meant to be all along. So that gets to the heart of what is the heart of God, right? The gospel is ultimately God's heart. What is the heart of God? It is human flourishing. It is providing for us. He wants to be our provider. He is the only provider, and he makes that clear. And our rebellion is that much more ugly, that we turn away from the fountain of living waters and look to our own, little pits that we can dig in the dust and put some water in and try to say, no, I've got it. God wants to be bountiful with us. So I would just say, in the gospel, we have this infinite resource. And if you've received the gospel as a Christian, you have this resource. Now, we don't always remember it, and so we have to be reminded. But, I was thinking of, you can think of so many different metaphors, and forgive me for, mentioning several because it's a lot, but you just to show, the different metaphors that God uses. Some of them, Jesus talks about the gospel of the kingdom being like a treasure hidden in the field, right? So you have a treasure. If you have faith in Christ, you've received a treasure, an inheritance that's imperishable, unfading. The scriptures teach that God actually dwells in our hearts through faith when we come to know him. God living inside of you. Paul says, Christ in you, the hope of glory. Well, there's another metaphor that says you have this resource. There's so many more. It all comes down to, does it make a difference? Does the gospel make a difference, right? I think the scriptures would say, you don't have the gospel, you don't have assurance of that resource. If you do have the gospel, you have every resource, eternal, imperishable, ready, with a Father who loves you, who's going to care for you. Turn to him, remind yourself, speak to your heart, preach to yourself that he is our good shepherd and that he has everything you need. And so, anxiety is real, but our resource is much greater. And I think that's essentially, I think the gospel provides us with that certainty.
Right, and I think that's maybe the difference between having the gospel and not having the gospel, right? Which was bringing it back to the question and the importance of preaching that gospel to yourself. Because if you're not a Christian, you don't have the content of the sermon that you need. so in my Easter sermon, it's part of the thing I was trying to think through is how do we rejoice in good news when there's so much bad news everywhere? Is it even appropriate to talk about good things when we ought to be talking about bad things? And kind of where I ended up on that, though, is that, good news is always appropriate if good news wins. Like if the ultimate end is actually good news, then good news helps us with the bad news. And in the case of Easter, in the case of the resurrection, what we have is actually even death, the worst news there is, even death is conquered by the good news. There's a resurrection after death. And so not believing that, though, not believing that gospel, you don't have the content necessary to get you out of that bad news state. You don't have assurance that there is something beyond the grave. You don't have the assurance of a resurrection or a God who loved you enough to provide it. Whereas in the gospel, what you have is a good news that is better than any bad news that could ever happen. And so with that, you always have a sermon to preach to yourself, to help you with no matter what may come. But I'll say this for the Christian, it is a discipline to remember that. Because we do get anxious and there are bad things that happen, and it's very easy for us to get in sort of a tunnel vision worldly mindset and forget good news trumps bad news for us. We do await a resurrection, and that because it's a discipline, because it doesn't always, we don't always naturally think about that when the bad news comes. There's that remembrance, that speaking to yourself rather than listening to yourself, so to say, in terms of the way you approach the gospel. Kind of building on that, because it is recognizing bad things happen. Life is filled with deep hurt and loss. That was true of in the Bible. That was true of Christ himself. So recognizing that grieving is right, whereas we're not to be anxious, but we are commanded to grieve. How do we grieve appropriately without letting it turn into fear and become anxiety?
Right. We were talking earlier, and it occurred to me, yes, the Bible never doesn't command us worry with those who worry, but it does command us to grieve with those who grieve. And it says we're to grieve differently. 1 Thessalonians 4, we are not to grieve like the rest who have no hope. Like stress and worry, grief will come for all of us. Grief is coming. The question is, how will we respond when it comes? Will we respond just like the rest of the world responds to grief? Or will we respond in a way that demonstrates to the world that we have a different hope?
Right.
Many things could cause us to grieve, but let's think about the ultimate one Parker brought up, death. Right. Death still grieves us as Christians, and it should. But the gospel transforms the way we see death. It's no longer just the great separator between us and our loved ones. Death, Christ has transformed it into the doorway, the gateway. Today, he says to the thief on the cross, you will be with me in paradise. And that ought to transform the way we grieve death. Now, I learned long ago that grief, kind of like stress and worry, comes to me in moments. It's not the tenor of life, but it comes in moments. I could be involved in something completely happy, a completely happy moment, and then something could remind me of a person or a thing that I lost. And internally, I say to myself, I wish that person was here to share this experience with me. And so even a sweet thing becomes a moment of grief, because I'm reminded, grief comes at me out of the blue. Mm-hmm. But when it comes, I think as Christians, we're to dress it up in truth that comes out of the Bible. Yes, I wish that person was here, but one day I will share much better moments than these with them again. Mm-hmm. And how we shall laugh together on when that day comes.
The good news beats the bad news.
The good news beats the bad news. Yes. So embrace grief when it comes out of the blue, right, with truth. that comes out of the Bible.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's made me think of a recent article by a prominent Christian scholar that many people probably have debated and discussed. I think so. In the article had a terrible title. It's something like "Christians Don't Have an Answer for the Coronavirus." That was like the title of the article by N.T. Wright. And reading it, I thought, I think he's making this point, the answer to this question. Although I think he misses what you just said. I think in the tone of his article, I don't think he believes that. Maybe it's just poorly written or thought out. But he's saying, we have to be a people who know how to lament. And we need to know how to suffer. And all these Christians who are trying to say, "Don't worry, there's an answer. There's, don't fret about these things." He calls them Christian rationalists, and that's a negative thing, right? They're rationalizing everything. And so I think his point is correct if you understand it in the bigger picture of what we're saying. That there's an ultimate resource, there is hope beyond hope. So if you take what he says as a minor point and not a major point, I think it's good. And I think, you look at Psalm 13, right? Psalm 13, there's this cry that the faithful have had. "Where are you, O Lord? How long, O Lord? Where are you? What's going on? I'm dying out here," right? That's kind of the essence of the cry of a faithful person who's suffering and who's grieving. And, but there is an element of faith in that of, well, Lord, if I'm alone in my suffering, my first instinct is to call out to you, because you're the only one I can turn to, and you're the one who made me.
Where else can I go?
Yeah. Where else can I go? And so I think if we, maybe if I want to graciously understand what he's saying about Christian rationalists, maybe we could think of the Christian rationalist, if it really is a bad thing, as the person who kind of avoids that thought, who doesn't want to even think about sitting alone in silence and dust and ashes, right? That's what Job did when he first experienced his intense suffering. Maybe the Christian rationalist is like the friends of Job who quickly try to fix his problem and say, stop, surely this is because you sinned. You need to repent. That's the problem. Here, we fixed your problem. So maybe that is a warning for us that we need to be people who can grieve, right? We're made in the image of God. God grieves over evil. He grieves over the fallen creation. So maybe we need to open our hearts a little bit more and let the reality of suffering of other people and in our own lives really sit with us for a minute before we try to go, telling everyone else around what they should do or how they should be feeling. But it can't end there, and that's, I think, where the danger is. If you feel like lamentation and silence is the final word, I just don't think that's biblical.
Yep.
I think biblically, joy and confidence in God's future is the final word. In God, and I think N.T. Wright would agree with that. But I have a friend right now who, they sent an email about a nonprofit work that they do in Mexico, and saying these youth that they work with are trying to figure out how to get supplies into their town because the supply chains are totally disrupted there, and they don't even have toilet paper. And they're worried about, can they even get food to their small town? And you think, that's something I need to let enter my world and try to understand and hear. My experience isn't that kind of intense, situation. And so we need to be open to those things, I think. But yeah, it turns into fear when we stop acting, we stop praying, effectively when we become paralyzed. And so I think crying out to God in those moments, feeling those things, feeling the grief, but just like Macron said, we are at war, right? In wartime, I'm sure that people in wartime are experiencing grief every day of lost friends, of missions that are failed, of shortcomings they have, but they have to keep picking up and fighting. Yep. And I think that's to me, that's probably the balance, is that we just have to keep picking up, pushing back against the fear, and fight through prayer, generosity, whatever God might give us to do to try to make a difference and move from that place of feeling deeply to acting with empathy. And
yeah. So I want to jump in on that. that idea of empathy, because this, we're part of a church, right? And we're living our Christian lives in community, in covenant community, if you're a church member. And so part of what I've been thinking through with this topic about anxiety is how to grieve, how to have empathy for people in our church that are struggling without crossing the line into anxiety and worry. Where is the line between empathy and anxiety? And let me frame this a bit. In general, what I will say is that what I've noticed about people is that different things cause different people to worry. And so with me, and a part of this is my background. I grew up having some health issues, and so I spent a lot of time in hospitals. I had several trips to the emergency room with asthma. I had longer stays with other kind of chronic illnesses. And so just because I had so much experience around medicine and doctors and these kind of things, I don't get stressed about those things. I don't worry about medical related things that much myself. And that can sometimes, I feel like, cause me to have a lack of empathy for those who do really worry about those things and do really have concerns about those things. In saying that, on the other side, sometimes I really worry about things that other people don't worry about. I get really stressed when it comes to administrative things or going to the prefecture in France and trying to get my visas. And I get super stressed when I'm doing my taxes. Those things cause immense worry in my heart, whereas going to the doctor causes almost none. And, maybe that some people might think that's silly, but that's just the way it is. I don't worry about those kind of things. And so the question then for me is, in a community with each other, where is that line between I'm not worried about my brothers and sisters, but I am concerned in a godly way about their needs and struggles? Can you guys help me out with this question?
Yeah, that's a good one, Parker. Because you don't want to take on someone else's anxiety, right? Especially things you're not worried about, and all of a sudden that they've been dumped on you, and now you're worried with them. Again, we're not called to worry with those who worry. We're called to grieve with those who grieve. So just a couple thoughts on what I would do in terms of going through times of anxiety and grief with someone in my church family. First, I think you want to be present with them. Paul's already referenced Job's friends. The best thing Job's friends did was those first 7 days where they just were with Job and sat silently. So be present in it, and it helps immensely if you've already cultivated a depth of relationship with someone before a time of grief hits, before they go through an anxious season. There you already have the relationships, and so just being present with them matters. The second thing I would say is ask questions of them. Seek to understand their situation, what's really going on, what's at the heart of their anxiety. If you ask the right questions, maybe you can get them to speak the truth that they most need to hear instead of that coming from you. And then as that's happening, I think third, you affirm the truth that you do hear them speak. And then gently speak truth when it comes out that they're believing lies and not the truth. And admitting your own struggle. You struggle to believe the truth yourself. Like you said, Parker, I don't get anxious with medical things, but I do get anxious with these issues that you probably aren't anxious about at all. Right. So I can empathize while not sharing your anxiety over these things. Right. We live in a fallen, broken world, and we are all wired differently in how we struggle with it. And so we can find common ground. And at times I can speak the truth that you need to hear. You speak the truth to me that I need to hear.
Yeah. And just hearing you say that, I think, sometimes your calm response to my frantic worry is actually what I need. I made a mistake in my taxes this past year, and I mentioned that's a cause of worry for me. And I was freaking out, and I don't have the money to do this, and all, and there's a church member who just helped me out with it, who was completely calm. Oh yes, I know, and it just like it was a balm to my anxious soul, and so I think that's part of it. Maybe is
right.
he was concerned.
When you're freaking out, you don't need the person you're talking to.
Exactly.
Well. That's generally not helpful.
Right, and he was concerned for me, but he was not worried for me, and I think that made a big difference for me. Yeah, and I think it relates to the coronavirus. People going through the medical risk, sometimes serious, life-threatening situations. But we can respond with concern and empathy and being there without panic, because of the gospel.
Yeah, to me, this whole situation, pretty early on, I started to realize that, depending on people's background, maybe whether it's a family, whether it's a student, whether it's a senior adult, whether it's a single, whether they live in the city, whether they live in the country, maybe their economic status, all these things. There's a lot of different experiences of confinement out there. And in the church, we have to recognize that. And, I think I'd want to say, I hope that the family who has a little bit more resource, who has a yard, I hope that they're soaking it up. I hope that they're enjoying it and having a really great special time. But to me, the fear that I have would be if the church is not aware, if a person is not aware of what other people are going through, and is not engaged and doesn't realize the different experiences. Even with, again, the announcement the other night from Macron with his speech, the reason that they want to get school back in session is that they're worried about the disenfranchised children. And I thought, wow, that's really thoughtful. Like, they're thinking about this situation, the stress that it's causing, and even the danger that some children are in. In the church, we should be all the more aware of what's going on. And that only happens by being connected and listening and being attuned to the experiences of others. The fear I'd have is the person who is enjoying and making the most of this time is that they wouldn't kind of open their ears and their hearts to what other people are going through. Because it's not that God wants, kind of like KJ's saying, it's not that God wants us to worry with those who worry, or that we can't have joy when other people are struggling. It's that we don't need to be blind to it. We need to be aware of it. We need to do the best with what we have, make the most of the time that we have, the resources we have, but then be aware of what other people are going through. And I think that's a good word for the church, is that we need to be aware of the different ways that people are experiencing confinement. And don't just assume. It may be that you and your joy can go and encourage someone who is really not feeling joyful, right?
Right. Yeah. And so just one last question to pick up on the particularities of that for our context. We are an international church. All three of us are living far away from family during this time, as are probably a lot of the people listening to this. So as internationals, how does that dynamic affect anxiousness in the current crisis?
Yeah, I'd say as foreigners and immigrants, we have an additional layer of helplessness added into our lives in the present crisis. Our families are all a long, long way away. We can't be of help to them, and they can't be of help to us in a time of distress. We've lost our support systems, and we've lost our ability just to live on autopilot like you have in your home culture. All the things you can do at home without thinking now require a lot of thoughts when you live somewhere else, when you live outside your culture. I mean, just if you get sick, what do you do? Who do you call? You're navigating a system where your doctor asks for a cash payment, and you're like, is this what's expected? Was I supposed to bring a lot of cash with me? I don't know. You're more vulnerable because you don't know the systems and the place. Generally, as foreigners living in a country, everything is fine until it's not, right? Until there's an emergency, and times of emergency take a bit bigger mental toll on you. But I would say this all makes for a strong apologetic for the church. It's been our church family who have helped us here as foreigners in another country, as expats and immigrants far away from all of our support systems. It's the church who becomes our family and support. And I mean, really, that's what we found as an international church here in Paris. How wonderful, how beautiful God's family is when it comes from all around the world, living as exiles in another place. We truly live for and help one another.
Yeah, I think when you think about the blessings of home, it can cause anxiety about the situation you're in instead as an international kind of far removed from that. So I'm not going to lie. I can think of and picture being with our family right now back in Tennessee. Both my parents and Abby's parents are there. Cousins are there. They have a little more freedom. They can go visit each other at their houses, assuming someone's not sick. I can imagine the kids playing in the yard and, with the cousins and cooking meals together and, watching movies and all that. I can imagine that. And it would be beautiful, but that's not where God called us, right? He's called us here. And I think that's the solution there as an international, recognizing that God has always called his people to be, as we preached through 1 Peter this year, to be foreigners and exiles from their true home. Our ultimate home is in heaven. We wait for that reality where our greatest joy is and our greatest peace and comfort is. But now as internationals, we experience it in a different way. And we just embrace that calling. God has put us here. He has, again, we talked about resource. He's given us the remedy for these anxieties. He's given us infinite resources in the gospel. And this isn't going to be easy, but it can be good. And so I've been thankful for Abby. I think God has been strengthening us and the kids together. Some days when I felt weak and despairing a little bit, she's been strong and moving us forward. And some days when she's been discouraged, I've been able to encourage her. I hope that's true for many of our families in the church are experiencing that. But I think it comes from embracing that calling. God called us here. That means he will equip us here and to live for his glory. And if that's not true, then I have no hope and let's get home. But if
Can I say one more thing, Parker, based off what Paul just said, of just the sense of calling? It was something that Tim Chester said to us when we went to England to help plant a church. And this goes for everyone who's made tough calls and moved families for the sake of the gospel. He said that gospel ministry always comes with a price. There is a price to pay. But when you recognize it, this is the price I have to pay in order to do gospel ministry, big things feel smaller, right? What is too much to pay to serve King Jesus who died for me? So if anyone's listening to this who has moved their family away from their support systems to do gospel ministry somewhere else, there is a price to pay. You're paying it now, but you are paying it to do gospel ministry. And what then is too big?
Yeah.
Amen.
Well, and just, in closing, because the gospel is true, right? Even when we're in a stressful situation apart from home, there's both a present and future aspect of the gospel that helps us. One, because the gospel is true, and because God has determined where we live, and we trust in that aspect of things as well, there's always something to be thankful for. Look around you. You may. There's many things out there that can stress you out, but there's no lack of blessings God has given you that you can't right now be grateful, and let that change your heart. And then two, there's the future longing that this ought to be bringing up in our hearts. Yes, we're aliens and exiles. Yes, we're in confinement. We're in prison. in our homes. Yes, we have Netflix, but we are at home and we cannot leave. And we want to leave. Right now I'm looking out the window at a gorgeous spring day. This is the kind of day you move to Paris for, and I'm not out there. But I have a longing to go out there, and that longing is just an echo of my bigger longing to be with Christ and to be with Him for eternity, in a day when there's going to be no more suffering and death. And so I think even as internationals, we can take this opportunity to let us long for the eternal, let us long for God, and let these anxieties produce and enrich those longings. Even more.
Amen.
Guys, that about does us for today in terms of time. We are planning to do another one next week. Shall I tease the topic for next week?
Sure.
Yeah, so the topic we're looking at for next week is about reading. And how do you determine what books to read? And so that'll be the topic, guys. A good one, I think, for this time. Hopefully you guys are having some extra time to read, so we'll look forward to that for next week. But that'll close us for today. God bless.